Hi, we continue in Genesis 32 today after Jacob has let Laban and his entourage go off, and he is now anticipating a reunion with his brother Esau, which from Jacob's perspective is not a good prospect. He has just sent messengers out to try to placate Esau, and yet the messengers have come back saying Esau and 400 men are coming here. And as we see in the beginning of our passage on the left side of the screen, the narrator tells us Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, using language that's as strong as the Hebrew language could be to describe Jacob's shape of his feelings right now. So before we get into that, just a few things to set ourselves into the context. You see on the right side of the screen the shape of the Jacob story that we've been going through throughout the whole section from 25:19 forward, and now we're down in this section down here. I won't go over it again, but if you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you to pay attention to how the story sounds different. We read it from different reading times, from the time of the story, the time of the writing, the time of translation, the time of the New Testament, Roman times, and our time. And again, that helps us to understand how different authors now, different scholarly authors now, as well as different interpreters within the Bible and in the Midrash have approached this story differently perhaps than we might today. So one of the things we've been looking at, and I'll point out a couple of examples that are in our passage, is how this whole unit, in many ways summarizing the whole Jacob story, has a series of word plays and implicit references both back to earlier sections in the Jacob story, but also to, as I've been connecting in various ways, the relationship with the David story. So if you followed in the situation from chapters 28 to 31, when Jacob was in Laban country, I showed an allegory of all the relationships between Laban and his daughters as an expression of the relationship between Israel and Mesopotamia in the time of exile, and before that, when Israel was taken by the Assyrians and Judah was waiting 140 years to be taken by the Babylonians. Not that they were waiting for that to happen, but that's how long it took in between. So a number of references like that highlight how, for close readers, this is a summary of not only the Jacob cycle, but of many other things going on in the story. So let's put up our keywords so we can see how our section fits here. We're continuing from where we are here, and I noted last time the little ABA chiasm we can see in this unit here. Not exactly, well, it is exactly, I'm sorry, the way the paragraphs are. Here you see behind him is twin camps and the camps down below. And so now we're in this section here and completing this. And this little unit here, not the whole unit from 7 to 12, which is what we see here, from this whole thing. This is actually from 9 to 12, the prayer. This part could be an ABA chiasm, as we'll see in just a minute, putting the statements that Jacob makes about God's actions on the frame and his own request in the center, as we'll see. So I'll leave that up as we begin to enter in our passage. So Jacob was greatly afraid here, using very strong language, as Wenham notes, used for people in dire straits when facing defeat, as we see in Judges. But notice it also has a correspondence in the David story here. David is in great danger, for the people spoke of stoning him because he had lost his hometown to raiders. But he recovers it later in the story. So David had a fear, and Jacob has a fear. Are Jacob and David corresponding? Well, maybe. But as you note here, in the series of correspondences between Jacob, Esau, and David, Edom, I might as well look at those right now as we begin our passage. So as we'll see momentarily, Jacob will plead with God to save him from Esau, whereas the exact opposite happens in 2 Samuel 8. David subdues Edom. In other words, there's no one there to save Edom, which is Esau, from David, who represents Judah, if not Israel. At that point in the David story, he's king over both, as we found out in this passage here in 2 Samuel 5. But David's origin and his basic loyalty is to Judah, and we find that when his grandson Rehoboam differs from his father Solomon in how to treat the Israelites rebel under the leadership of Jeroboam and are never part of a united monarchy again. So David and the David lineage plainly have more loyalty and more power in Judah than over Israel, which is a temporary expedient, only for two monarchical generations, David and Solomon. So there's certainly a parallel there implicit. Greatly afraid, and distress. Literally wrapped up. It's only here in Genesis, and it's 61 times in Hebrew Scripture. As Shea Held notes, the Midrash sees that the greatly afraid is related to Jacob's fear of being killed, and is distressed as his concern for killing Esau, where another Midrash has the terms reversed. But most scholars would see this as a hendiadys, that the two words combined, afraid and distressed, to express one concept, that Jacob is just flat out terrified of being killed by Esau, and not only that, having his whole family killed, as we see down here in the prayer. So in this dire strait, first he strategizes and then he prays. So he divided the people who are with him. The word here is only one other time. We'll see that coming up in chapter 33. And the flocks and herds and camels. And now we hear about the camels. But as we saw in the message earlier, he did not report camels via the messengers to Esau. We've seen that camels, back to chapter 24, are an expression of wealth. And the connection with chapter 24 is not a random one, because we'll see here that there are a number of correspondences between Jacob's prayer and the prayer in chapter 24 of Abraham's servant. As he approaches the land of Laban and will end up with Rebekah, of course, Jacob and Esau's mother. So now we know they're the camels, and we'd heard about them back in 30:43. We see that here. He grew exceedingly rich and had large flocks, male and female slaves, which is in the report through the messengers, but not the camels. So he's trying to suggest via the messengers to Esau that he's not nearly as rich as a guy who walks around with camels, but of course Esau will see the camels momentarily. And then into two companies, Machanoth here, and we see that again repeated down here into the two companies. And as my note below has, we can also read this at the allegorical level as a question of the strategy of what happens when these great empires, Assyria and Babylon, come along. They could be divided into Israel and Judah, and if one is destroyed, the other will escape. In the event, that's of course not what happened. They were separate entities at the time, and if Genesis is written from exile, the authors already know that. But it's certainly a sense of the people of Israel, who are the children of Jacob, of course, and their children's children, being divided here. But in the end, of course, they won't be divided. And then we continue down to his interior thoughts, although the Hebrew actually says he said. The New RSV has thinking because, of course, he's not talking to anybody. But note how it suggests that the narrator has omniscience here into Jacob's head. That's not God's voice. That's the voice of the narrator of Genesis, who's inside the character's head here. So this is what he's thinking. If Esau comes to the one company and destroys it, then the company that is left will escape. Now, that's not necessarily true. Esau has 400 men, and he's sending women and children, although these children are largely grown up at this point, some of them are at least, with a bunch of animals out there against 400 men. And certainly it doesn't seem likely that 400 men would not be able to take on these two companies. We recall from chapter 14 rather, that Abraham took 318 men and was part of the battle of 5 kings against 4 and rescued Lot. So the companies that Jacob's dividing his family into are hardly military garrisons here, and Esau could certainly take both of them. That's what he wanted to do. But Jacob's not thinking that clearly here, and Esau doesn't want to do that, as we'll find out. The word for destroyed here, hard to pronounce without the vowels, nachach here, vahika in the form it's here, has a connotation of military attack, and that's certainly what he's thinking, that Esau's going to come down to him with his troops. And so now we hear his prayer. And with that there, I really want to focus more on what we see on the right side of the screen. So in this left column is his prayer, just these verses put here. And I've color-coded the echoes that we see in other places. So we note that in chapter 31, Jacob simply said to Laban, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac. So here in our current situation, he refers to the God of my father Isaac, but there the fear of Isaac. Is that suggesting he has had a developed understanding of his father Isaac's relationship with God? We can't know, or does that sound like a better thing to say when he's addressing God directly, which he wasn't doing here? It's not clear, but there's certainly a difference there. Then we recall back at the beginning of this frame around the situation when he'd had the epiphany of the what's often called the ladder, but really of the road up to the sky, that he'd made this vow. And notice it's one way, just like this is one way. These are not interactions with God. God speaks to Jacob, as we saw back here in 31:3, and Jacob speaks to Elohim here. Oh, here it's Yahweh that he's speaking to. It's Elohim here, and it's Yahweh here. And yet we have no interaction between them. We have no sense that Yahweh or Elohim responds to Jacob, or that Jacob responds to Yahweh when there's that word. But we hear that in the prayer that he begins with, he recalls Yahweh saying, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. And that's what we see echoed here. Although Jacob doesn't recall it exactly right, what we heard there was, I will be with you. And here he recalls that as, I will do you good. So not an exact recollection, but pretty close. And then, so we see the vow here, stated before both of the promises that we hear from Yahweh. So here, that promise in 31:3 after 28:20, and then of course the one that Abraham heard. Does Jacob know about that one? Is parallel here. We've not heard Yahweh or Elohim say directly to Jacob, I will make your offspring as the sand of the sea. We heard it here to Abraham. Does Jacob know about that? Well, Jacob's never met his grandfather as far as we know. But would Isaac know about that? Would Isaac have told him? This is right after the binding of Isaac, and we don't know of any relationship between Abraham and Isaac after that. And would Abraham have told that, well, you almost died, my son, but now the promise is there's going to be many more children after you? We just don't know whether that conversation ever happened, but it's not reported in the story. And the question of his recalling the chesed ve'emet, the Hebrew for the steadfast love and all the faithfulness here, we heard that echoed from the servant of Abraham here in 24:27. And that is more likely that Jacob knows about that, of course, because this is part of the story that he would certainly ask his dad, how did you meet my mom? How did you two meet? And since we know Jacob was back in Laban's country for 20 years, Laban could well have told him the story, all those years ago when your grandfather sent the servant to me. So there's no reason to think either from Laban or from his parents that Jacob wouldn't know the story of how his parents met. And he could certainly hear that echoed here. But then everything else he says here is on his own. It's primarily a cry for deliverance, and we'll look at that in more detail in our text here. So Jacob says, O God of my father, and this is the kind of thing that leads some scholars to want to separate sources. But notice what happens if you try to take this part out. We have, O God of my father and God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, jumping to right here, skipping over the return to your country, which is key not only to our story here, but as we'll see, to what happens in the horror story of chapter 34, when Jacob stops short of returning to his home country. And we'll get to that soon enough. So I see no basis at all for trying to separate supposed Elohist or Yahwist elements here. It's a tightly integrated unit. So what he recalls clearly designing to say, oh God, I want to hold you to your promises. You said to me, but notice what it's saying. God said to him, you do this, Jacob, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. Although, as we noted, I will be with you. And so what he's recalling is a command that Jacob is on, not really a promise from Yahweh. Here, the country and your kindred is exactly what we heard in 31:3. As Brueggemann notes below, Jacob is presented as completing the sojourn which has been underway for 3 generations, or at least about to complete it, but he doesn't quite, as we'll see. And I will do you good is noting the contrast to what I saw, what we noted here, I will be with you. So then we have a translation issue that we really need to look out here. Westermann, from earlier scholarly methods, as I've been noting throughout, says, it is a precious witness how in a later period the Jacob story was seen in the light of the piety of the Psalms. But as my own note says, it could easily be the other way around, because Westermann's still under the view that Genesis is an old text from the Yahwist period and that the Psalms are later. But the Psalms could well be from the monarchical period and the exilic period, and Genesis could be echoing the Psalms rather than the other way around. So that's one of those elements of the reading times of how we pay attention to that, as well as our understanding of when the text is most likely to have been composed in the form we have it. So I'm not worthy is really covering over an important element here. Literally, as I put in the keywords thing here, he says, I am too small for all the steadfast love, using the word katan here. Here without the vowels in its primary form, and here with the vowels, we saw it especially in 27:15 and 42. Let's go back and look at that and see how the translation is covered over the pairing here. So here we have I'm not worthy for the word, and here we have younger. I'll put them on our younger son, but it's the same word, katan here, the small son. So Jacob is the small son, and Esau is the larger son. Is that saying something about their size as well as their age? We don't know anything about their sizes otherwise. But here Jacob calls on that. I am too small to receive the hesed and emet. Certainly small, he doesn't mean physically small there. He certainly means too small of a person there. Does he really believe that, or is he being bragging humble brag, as we might say, in order to get Yahweh's favor? Would Yahweh be convinced of that? Probably not, but Jacob's in desperate circumstances. The phrase here, as I noted, it was echoing from chapter 24. So all that hesed va'emet that you've shown to your servant, speaking of himself in the third person, which is appropriate, but he's also spoken of himself in the third person via the messengers to Esau, as he will directly to Esau in their meeting coming up soon. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan. And the word for the staff here is the same word for the rods with which he engaged in the magical realism scene there of getting the sheep and the goats to breed the kind of colors that were the colors of the stripped rods. As John Anderson notes below, this can be heard by Yahweh on two different levels. On the first, the once destitute Jacob has grown exceedingly wealthy through Yahweh's fidelity to the promise. And two, the method by which Yahweh has demonstrated this fidelity in the past was by using deception, which is to say that Yahweh collaborated with the tricking of Laban over the business with the spotted and the striped sheep. So suggesting that Jacob's deception is part of Yahweh's deception. So just you and me, Yahweh, huh? As I noted earlier, the crossed here, used 10 times in these 2 chapters, is the Hebrew word. So I Hebrewed this Jordan, certainly bringing out the primal image of crossing in Deuteronomy that Moses doesn't do, but all the Israelites do, ahead of Moses, just as these 2 companies are going to be sent out ahead of Jacob. But Jacob, of course, won't just stay on the other side as Moses stays on the other side. The Jordan is only mentioned a couple times earlier in chapter 13. It was Lot looking out at the well-watered plain of the Jordan, and we'll see it in the very end on the last chapter. But this is certainly echoing what we see from Deuteronomy. And as my map showed, and you can see it from this Google Maps, the Jordan River is very close to the Jabbok, where he is right now. So now I've become 2 companies, as if Yahweh doesn't, or El doesn't know that. And here's the meat of the matter. Deliver me, or save me, Nitzal, using the word for saving, and we see that'll be fulfilled at 32:30 at the end of the encounter with, as we'll see, not the encounter with Esau, but the encounter with the wrestler. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother. And notice he calls him my brother here, even though it's going to be Lord, 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 as it was to the messengers, and it will be to Esau. And I note here how the hand and the face theme join. Hand and face are both key words, as we can see here. We see face being such a key word down here, and 4 times in one verse there, but we see hand here as well. So those body parts symbolic a hand of power and face of vulnerability and authenticity. So the power of Esau through his hand, repeated twice here, as you can see. For I am afraid of him. And now the truth of it comes out, not just for himself, but may kill us all, the mothers with the children. The mother's singular in Hebrew here, so that's an odd thing, not necessarily referring to one woman, but suggesting each mother with her own children, the mother and each child. As Zakovich suggests below, connotes unparalleled brutality if Esau were to do that. But as we'll see, Esau is not like that at all. Jacob has completely misjudged what 20 years have done to Esau. And now he comes back to try to quote Yahweh again, but a quote we didn't see. I will surely do you good, using a strong doubled language here, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which, as we noted, was the promise to Abraham way back when, but we don't know that Jacob's ever heard that, which cannot be counted because of their number. And the word for number here is rov, the word for elder, which is what we saw back in 25:23. The elder shall serve the smaller. And so, is that an implicit reference to Esau? Maybe not here, because there's the offspring that would come through Jacob and not the offspring that would come through Esau, which will also be numerous, but there it is just the same. So with that prayer in mind, Jacob's going to spend the night, and we're going to see the plan he has to try one more time to placate Esau before the meeting actually takes place. We'll see you for that next time. Bye-bye.